Happy Halloween, everyone! To mark the occasion, here's my review of Super Castlevania 4, originally released for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, but later re-released on other systems, and what you're seeing here is from the Castlevania Anniversary Collection, which is available on Steam. This is an action platformer by Konami and the sequel to Castlevania 3, although as far as story goes, it's more or less a remake of the original Castlevania. It was released in 1991 for the Super Nintendo and Super Famicom, and has gone on to be considered one of the best video games ever made by a very large number of people, especially if you're into platformers. And of course, among Castlevania fans, it always ranks very highly, if not at the very top. There's actually a fairly big split between Castlevania fans, where there's people who are fans of the Metroidvania style, and there's people who are fans of the old school platformer style, and depending on which camp they fall into, they're going to say either Super Castlevania 4 is the best, or they're going to say Symphony of the Night is the best. And while I have played more of the Metroidvania style of Castlevania, I don't really fall into either of those camps. Because in case you don't know, I'm absolutely terrible at platformers, and more importantly, I got burned out on them a very long time ago because there's just so many of them out there. So while there are still platformers I can enjoy, they tend to be fairly few and far between. Now, Super Castlevania 4 was not among those games that I played back in the day that ultimately got me burned out on platformers. In fact, I didn't play it until very recently because I just didn't have access to it. You see, when it comes to consoles, I've been kind of all over the place and had to play a lot of catch-up with those. Because I started out on Atari 2600 and 7800, and then from there I went to the Sega Genesis, which of course means that the very first Castlevania game I got to play was Castlevania Bloodlines, which actually came out after this did. And then after the Sega Genesis, I ended up getting an Atari Jaguar, and from there, the next console I got was a Nintendo GameCube. So I didn't have access to Super Castlevania 4 until very recently when the SNES Classic came out, and I ended up picking up that, and of course I have access to it on the Nintendo Switch and now through Steam with the Castlevania Anniversary Collection. This means I have absolutely no nostalgia for the game whatsoever. It's not something that's going to cloud my judgment when it comes to how good this is as a platformer in and of itself, how it stacks up compared to other platformers of its era, whether it improves upon anything from Castlevania 3, and of course how it still holds up after all these years. So let's go ahead and just start delving right into it and see what exactly we're dealing with. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which sees a considerable upgrade over all three of its predecessors that would have been absolutely mind-blowing back when this first came out. The hardware capabilities of the Super Famicom and SNES are just leagues better than the capabilities of the NES and the Famicom, and that is reflected in the dramatically expanded color palette, as well as the much improved sprite work that has a lot more detail in it, the improved sprite layering, meaning that you can have overlays now, not just the background and the foreground, meaning that you can have effects like things that are showing up in the foreground and Simon walking behind them, as opposed to just having things in the background and then Simon and all the other monsters and such being in the foreground. And there's even certain levels that try to give the game a bit of a 3D look, although that tends to result in the frame rate absolutely tanking because the hardware wasn't really capable of handling 3D all that well. It is precisely the kind of look you get when the developers have access to brand new technology that dramatically expands what they can actually produce, and they just go nuts with it. And sure, pixel art platformers are basically a dime a dozen these days, but you really don't get all that many of them that look quite as good as Super Castlevania 4 still manages to look to this day. And the improvements over the previous generation of consoles don't stop there. Moving over to the SNES and Super Famicom, you got a much better sound chip, and a better sound chip even than the Genesis in a lot of ways. Although, as I mentioned in my Castlevania Bloodlines Redux, if you got somebody who knows what they're doing, they can still produce some really fantastic tracks for the Genesis as well, but I digress. The point is that the sound chip in the Super Nintendo was absolutely fantastic for its era, and the developers took full advantage of it. The sound effects themselves are a considerable improvement over the beeps and bloops we got in the NES era, although they still don't really have a huge amount of impact behind them, and some of them do still sound very gamey in the sense that they're still beeps and bloops. It's just that they are considerably more detailed beeps and bloops. Now, the one thing that the Super Famicom and SNES didn't really bring to the table trouble, at least until later on when they really tried to make it work, was voice acting, and so you don't get any of that with Super Castlevania 4, but what you do get is one hell of a soundtrack. Some tracks do return from previous games, although remixed to fit the new sound chip and the considerably improved capabilities of it, as well as some brand new tracks that all generally sound very good, although some of them really excel compared to others, like of course the theme of Simon. Some of the tracks get you amped up for the action, whereas other ones are more atmospheric and help to set a more oppressive mood, which is something that the original games didn't really do all that much, because the original Famicom and the NES were fairly limited in what you could do with the soundtracks in those. And the end result there is that even though the frame rate does occasionally tank a bit, for the most part, the presentation is fantastic for its era, and it still holds up extremely well to this day. But of course, as great as the presentation is, what really matter are the story and the gameplay. Although this being an old school style platformer, it doesn't really rely on story. It just ends up being the basic setup for why you're doing what you're doing, and the story in this is, much like I said previously, a pretty much remake of the original Castlevania, where you play as Simon Belmont, a member of the Belmont family fated to fight Dracula every 100 years because Dracula revives every 100 years and starts to wreak chaos upon the land, and it's the Belmont family's curse to go and defeat Dracula in this endless cycle. That's all there is to the story, so you can pretty safely ignore it, and what you're going to be focusing on is the gameplay, which, as I said, is that old school platformer style of Castlevania, where you go from stage to stage, you whip things, you use sub-weapons, and eventually you have a boss fight at the end of a stage, move on to the next stage, and eventually you'll end up fighting Dracula at the very end. If you've played Castlevania 1 or Castlevania 3, it's all going to be very familiar to you, although unlike in Castlevania 3, you only have the one character. You only play as Simon the entire time. You still move around with the D-pad, you have a button for jumping, and you have a button for attacking with the whip, but this time around you also have a dedicated button for throwing your sub-weapon out, which is going to be either a dagger, which shoots out in a straight pattern, or the axe, which gets thrown upwards in an arc, the cross boomerang, which gets thrown out in a straight pattern but also comes back to you and continues to do damage as it comes back, and the holy water, which you throw on the ground and it creates a fire effect. You still use hearts as ammunition for all of these sub-weapons, and you can find that and the sub-weapons themselves by whipping all of the candles that are scattered around the levels, with the hearts coming in only 2 increments, either 1 in the case of the small hearts or 5 in the case of the big hearts. At the end of every boss fight at the end of a stage, it drops a magic crystal, and whenever you pick that up, it replenishes all of your life and totals any of your remaining life and your remaining hearts into additional score, and once you hit certain score thresholds, you get a 1-up, meaning that you get an additional life. You can also occasionally find a very rare 1-up item that will drop when you whip a wall or a candle or something like that, but again, they're very rare, so more often than not, you're going to get 1-ups from the score rather than these 1-up drops. You can also improve your score by destroying enemies or picking up the sacks of money that will drop on the ground that are either from candles that you whip or from sometimes enemy drops as well. If you run out of lives, you're given the opportunity to either use a continue or to get a password that you can use to get back to where you were, and if you use a continue, it will put you back at the very beginning of the level you were on, and you'll have to go through the entire thing all over again without any of the upgrades that might have carried over from the previous level. Of course, the only things that do carry over are whatever additional lives you've earned, as well as your whip upgrades that you've found, and whatever sub-weapon you had at the end of the last stage. Of those, the whip upgrades and the extra lives are the most important, because the whip upgrades actually have a pretty significant impact on how you're going to actually play the game. You start with the whip just being a basic leather whip and not really doing much damage and having a very short range. Then you will upgrade that to a Morning Star, which has the same range as the leather whip but does more damage, and then you'll upgrade that to the full-length Morning Star, which has a quite long range and also does more damage. The additional range is absolutely vital in a lot of cases because it will allow you to whip enemies from quite a long distance away, so you don't have to worry about getting hit by them for a ton of damage. Because this is still very much an old school platformer in the sense of it is very difficult, and in fact in a lot of cases it's downright BS with its difficulty. But it's not as BS in its difficulty as the old Castlevania games were on the NES and Famicom. In fact, for the most part, it's actually a relatively fair difficulty, where for the most part, you can rely on your skills with the controls in order to avoid damage and make it all the way to the end. It's not always the case. In fact, there is some degree of random BS, particularly with enemies flying in from the side of the screen that you are just going to have to deal with, and there are a lot of instances where you're not necessarily going to know that something either kills you instantly or does a metric ton of damage or is a death trap, and you're just going to bumble into it the first time and then have to waste one of your lives in order to continue. And that does get rather frustrating when it does happen, but it's not anywhere near as bad as especially something like, say, Castlevania 3 was. But it's not necessarily because of the way the levels themselves are designed as much as it is the vastly improved controls over the NES games. You have considerably more precise control over your jumps, so when you jump, it's not just you jump and you're committed to that from the beginning. It's now a jump and you can adjust it a bit while you're in the air. You also have the ability to whip in every single direction now by moving the D-pad around when you press the whip button. So if you go up, then you'll just whip up. If you do up and right or up and left, then you'll whip diagonally upwards. If you're doing left and right, of course, you'll whip either of those directions like you normally would in the old games. And if you want to whip downwards, then you do have to jump, but you can still press the D-pad down and either to the left or right to whip downwards in either a diagonal or straight down direction. And you can even attack with the whip and continue holding the button down in order to let the whip dangle, and from there you can start moving it around with the D-pad, and while it's not going to do anywhere near as much damage as a normal whip strike, it still can be useful in the right situations. You can also use the same idea by whipping out and holding the button down to latch onto rings that are scattered around the levels in order to either just dangle from them or to swing left or right, and this actually comes in very handy during certain levels where you need to swing across gaps, or in one particular level's case, you need to whip and grab onto a ring and dangle there as the room itself rotates around a spike trap. And the end result of all these changes to the controls is that the game has a considerably refined feel compared to all of its predecessors, and frankly, a lot of its successors as well. I mean, in subsequent Castlevania games, they would chip away at the whip controls until it was basically back to the way it worked in the old NES games, and that just meant you have considerably less control over it. And while they did certainly improve the movement controls to some degree, and of course the jumping controls, you never really felt like you were in total control as much as you do in Super Castlevania 4. I mean, it's certainly not perfect, and sometimes the angles that you can whip at don't necessarily get to what you're needing to whip before the enemy actually is able to hit you, and that can be fairly frustrating. But it still puts the whipping controls in seemingly more advanced games like, say, Rondo of Blood or Castlevania Chronicles to shame. And the considerably improved controls in this ultimately contribute to the game being not quite as punishingly difficult as Castlevania 3 was, although again, it is still a pretty difficult game, especially if you're not used to old school platformers, and ultimately makes it both the most accessible and the most enduring of the old school Castlevania games. This is really the only old school Castlevania game I can say that pretty much anybody can pick up and play, although you may not necessarily be able to finish it without a whole lot of trial and error and a whole lot of failing miserably before you get to that point. And of course, with the more modern ports of it, there's always save states, although you will always see the old school fans shrieking about how that's not playing it the way it's meant to be played, but whatever. Regardless of whether you're using save states or just constantly having to restart the game or whatever the case may be, it's still not a particularly long game. As far as old school platformers go, it's fairly average in length, being at about an hour long, although you will see speedruns that are closer to half an hour. And a lot of how long it's going to take you is just going to depend on how good at the game you are. Now, as I mentioned before, I am terrible at platformers, so I took quite a long time with it, even with save states. Although, a long time by old school platformer standards is basically about 2 to 2.5 hours in my case. Again though, your mileage is going to vary depending on how good at platformers you are. Regardless of your skill level though, again, this is really the only old school Castlevania game that I can recommend to you, regardless of whether you're a fan of old school Castlevania games or just old school platformers in general or not. It has the best overall experience of all of the old school Castlevanias, as well as having the most refined controls and not really being anywhere near as punishing as most of the other ones are. It gives you a fair few healing items scattered around the levels, more than the old NES games did, and it it doesn't give you quite as much BS as you had to deal with in those old NES and Famicom games did either, and if you compare it to Bloodlines, it is considerably easier to pick up and play, although I do still recommend Bloodlines if you're already a fan of old school platformers, or especially old school Castlevania. And of course, if you're a fan of old school platformers and you haven't played Super Castlevania 4 yet, you definitely should. And of course, these days it's extremely easy to get your hands on a copy of it, so there's not really much excuse not to give it a try. It's included with the Castlevania Anniversary Collection, which is available on PC via Steam, as well as PS4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch, and that's a collection of 8 games in total, including all of the old NES and Famicom games, as well as even Castlevania Bloodlines. And it even includes Japanese versions of a lot of those games too, including Castlevania 4, which is really the best way to play Castlevania 4 because it's the uncensored version of the game, where you have blood pools and such instead of green slime, and you have certain more religious iconography still being in there, as opposed to being removed in the Western version. Because in case you didn't know, up until the mid to late 90s, games on Nintendo systems were generally censored pretty heavily in the West, because they were afraid that Western audiences would be offended by things. Of course, then we made games like Doom and Mortal Kombat, and that made them look kinda silly. Anyway, the point is that Super Castlevania 4 was an absolutely fantastic platformer in its day that still holds up extremely well, although admittedly it does piss me off quite a lot because I'm terrible at platformers, and that's always going to happen with any of these old school platformers, no matter how good they are. If you're a fan of the Castlevania series and you haven't given Super Castlevania 4 a try yet, you definitely need to, and if you were looking for a good starting point in the old school style of Castlevania, then this is definitely the one to take a look at. It is a considerably more forgiving game than Castlevania 1, 2, and 3, as well as Bloodlines, even though Bloodlines actually did come out after this did. And while it certainly does still have its problems, it's definitely not just a historical curiosity like the old NES and Famicom games are at this point. This is one you can still readily pick up and play and enjoy to this day. And if you're interested in giving it a try, I'll have a link in the video description box to where you can pick up the Castlevania Anniversary Collection on Steam. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every single cent I get from that goes directly back into the channel, whether that be getting additional games for review, or additional equipment, or whatever the case is. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option is there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.